What is going on, everybody? Welcome to another Logical, Plausible, Probable. You better buckle up because today, for the second time in as many months, I've got the opportunity to have a conversation with the one and only Perry Marshall, someone that I have followed for quite some time on one of my favorite topics, and that is the unavoidable reality that information and communication theory are fundamental to our very existence. And when viewed through that prism, the plausibility of neo-Darwinism just implodes. Now, when I say you need to pay attention, I really mean that, because when he's not donating his time for conversations like this one, Perry's actually one of the most expensive business strategists in the world. He's been endorsed by Forbes and Inc. magazine. He's in all sorts of stuff, folks. And Harvard Business Review has recognized him. NASA's Jet Propulsion Labs using his 80-20 curve as a productivity tool. I mean, there's so many things that are going on. And if that wasn't enough, he's also an electrical engineer and published scientist aiming to solve the #1 mystery in artificial intelligence and life itself. And to further that objective, he organized a private equity fund. And in 2019, at the London's Royal Society, he announced the world's largest science research challenge, the $10 million Evolution 2.0 prize, which is staffed by judges from Harvard, Oxford, and MIT. And if that wasn't enough, he's also got a phenomenal book that I strongly recommend. And there's a link to it in the description. And that is Evolution 2.0. Breaking the Deadlock Between Darwin and Design. It's over on Amazon. And there's also an amazing self-voiced audiobook version on audible.com, which I strongly recommend as well. I both read the book and listened to the audiobook, and it's fantastic. Read, great information, and really, each time I go through it, I pick up on something new, and it really kind of cracks me up how so eloquently the arguments are made, and so often the average supposed debunker has clearly not comprehended what is going on, and they really need to take some time to think these things through a little bit more clearly. So Perry, thanks so much for taking the time to join us again today. I'm looking forward to this, and we're going to go on a different topic today. Well, extenuation, I would say, of from the book and this paper. But how you doing? Welcome to the stream. How you doing?
I'm great. Great way to end a Friday afternoon is we're going to mix it up with some communication theory and some evolution. So it's going to be a fun afternoon.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate that very much. Now, in our first conversation, we stayed focused on your book and more on the primary concepts of that communication theory, right? And information theory, and how all of that and your knowledge and your background led you down a very interesting path. But leading up to all of that, you had sent me your paper from last year, and it was so interesting. I wanted to have you back on to discuss it, and thankfully you were willing to do so. And we got it scheduled for today. But now in preparation for this, folks, I got to tell you, reading through this paper was quite the doozy. And as I dove into the paper, which is Biology Transcends the Limits of Computation, and by the way, folks, the link to that is also in the description. Make sure you go and download the paper and read it for yourselves, because we're not gonna be able to get into all the components of it. It's very well articulated, and in spite of some of the folks who claim that you didn't actually make any points and it was just a bunch of fluff, which cracks me up to no end, there was a lot of substance, and I think people, if they pay attention and read it for themselves, will recognize that very, very quickly. However, before we get into the nuts and bolts and the details, can you kind of give us a 30,000 foot view of the concept, the model, and how you're basically proposing a complete reversal of kind of the conventional standard paradigm in terms of how does biology work?
So there's a story, and we've all heard it, and it goes like this. There was a warm pond, there was a lucky lightning strike, there was an RNA strand, it started self-replicating, and eventually it developed a code, and the code made selfish genes, and the selfish genes eventually started evolving and eventually got to us. And so you start with chemicals, and then you get code, and then eventually you get conscious beings who do cognitive things. And well, I applied my engineering background from this. I wrote an Ethernet book 20 years ago, and understanding, and I worked in digital networking industry for years. And what I noticed was everything in systems that we completely understand runs the opposite direction of that. So the traditional story says you start with chemicals, and then you get code, and then you get cognition. Well, in the paper, I say there are no examples in the literature of anybody ever getting from chemicals to code. It's never been done, doesn't exist anywhere. And in fact, I've got $10 million attached to that very question. So there has yet to be a single example of that empirically. Secondly, there's also this idea that if you get enough code going, that eventually something's going to wake up and you're going to get consciousness by virtue of having enough code. Once again, there is no evidence in any actual experiment or literature across any literature I've ever seen that shows that that's true. Once again, it's the opposite. What we know for a fact is that conscious beings generate code. We know that biology generates code. And we also know in biology, like basic genetics 101, chemicals don't control information. Information builds chemicals. A sequence of codons in the genetic code build amino acids, and which build proteins. So in biology, information controls chemicals. It's not the chemicals that control the information. So the standard story is completely backwards. Now, why does this matter and what does this tell you? Well, it tells you a couple things. First of all, it tells you that, or at least suggests, that when you're looking at immune diseases or cancer, which I've done a lot of work in the last 2.5 years, the question you should be asking yourself is, well, why did the cancer cells want to do that? Why do they want to speciate into 1,000 different species of tumor cells and fight all of the chemotherapy and the radiation that you're putting on them? Why are they trying to go over, go under, go to the left, go to the right, go through, right? Whatever it is you put in front of them, they're going to circumvent it. Why? Right? And
So
same with,
you're saying, why are they not just following strict deterministic rules, basically? Like,
right.
why are there going to be alternates to and alternate outcomes versus the same thing every time, kind of thing?
Right. No matter, and anybody in cancer can tell you, no matter what algorithmic or formulaic thing you do to try to stop cancer, it will come up with something non-algorithmic, non-formulaic that nobody's ever seen before. It is clearly not just simply running a program, right? And so another implication of this is that Siri is not going to wake up. Siri is as dumb as a box of rocks. Siri will continue to be as dumb as a box of rocks. Nobody's home. God bless them that she could tell you the temperature and that's great, but there's nobody home. And there's not going to be, because that doesn't come from code. It comes from something deeper. So that's the super high level view of what I wrote in that paper, which was published in Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology last year.
Now, that makes a lot of sense. And I think kind of the real-time example of the differentiation that you're kind of referring to is, I don't know if anybody's been paying attention, but over the past year, at least on Android, you might have noticed that your voice to text has started to be really bad. And one of the reasons for that is Google attempted to re-implement their more attempt at AI on determination and prediction of grammar and all this kind of stuff, right? Versus just strict phonetic translation, right? So if you ever notice, if you're looking at it, you'll see that the word that shows up initially, like in your text message or whatever you're doing, will be the correct one. It'll be the one that you actually said. And then the system will swap it for something else. And it's just like, I had a bigger picture and overall, like there was a following up clause that was going to make the word that I originally chose grammatically correct, right? But then they'll try and switch it, and it's like, just stop it. You have not figured this out. We have not figured out the cognition portion that you're kind of referring to, just on a baseline level of voice to text, right? Which obviously, from a software perspective, that's actually very complicated, just from a phonetic translation perspective, obviously. But now trying to do predictive, oof, it's a whole nother animal.
Well, Google's got a whole bunch of versions of this, and this comes up all the time in my conversations with customer and clients, because I wrote the world's best-selling book on Google advertising, and that's one of the most heavily invested in instances of AI in the whole world. And or Gmail constantly, have you noticed your friend that you've had for 17 years, who's had the same email address for 17 years, replies to your email and his reply goes to spam? You've been noticing this going on? Okay, that's Google's AI, right? And what's really going on? There's somebody going, oh, if you just let the machine run, it'll figure it out. You guys just wait. It'll figure it out. You guys just wait. Of course, it never figures it out.
Because that machine learning is just going to suddenly, pop. This new function is just going to pop into existence and be able to account for everything. Now, okay. So before we go, you and I get distracted on AI stuff. And I think this next question I have for you kind of dovetails nicely with this. So my next question is, there's a lot of folks who claim that things like I've made a formal like code arguments and all this kind of stuff, but they claim that it's just been completely debunked. Because a significant number of people will claim that the genetic code and transcription translation aren't Turing complete or Turing equivalent. Therefore, the genetic code isn't actually a code. Therefore, basically, all of your arguments are completely, just tossed out the window. So when I came across something you said pretty early on in the paper, I thought it was kind of funny, just substantive as well as just kind of entertaining to me, of like, how many times have people claimed, this point is just false? And I actually had somebody who supposedly debunked me in a whole review video a couple weeks ago on this exact topic and said, oh, it's not Turing complete. Therefore, everything that John said was completely wrong. So you said the process, quote, the process of DNA transcription translation conforms to the principles of digital communication, defining the field of bioinformatics. Mathematically, DNA transcription translation is equivalent to a Turing machine. So can you kind of explain what all that means? And more importantly, do the experts in communication theory question this?
No, they don't. Whoever you're quoting is completely ridiculous argument. So let's understand what a Turing machine is. I know it's a $100 word. It sounds really sophisticated. It's a computer with an input and an output. Any computer with an input and output is a Turing machine. A Casio digital watch is a Turing machine. Flashing electronic LED Christmas lights is a Turing machine. Your phone is a Turing machine. Your computer is a Turing machine. Your electronic toaster is a Turing machine. Input, output, rules. Okay. Now, does DNA transcription and translation have input, output, and rules? Yeah. There's a strand of DNA, and there's transcription rules, and there's translation rules, and that's a Turing machine. Look it up in Hubert Yaki's 2005 book. He shows why the two are isomorphic. A digital communication system is, by definition, a Turing machine. And it is digital code by definition. Everybody in biology has agreed on this since the early 1960s. Anybody who tells you otherwise is uneducated. Pick up a biology book, pick up a bioinformatics book, and get educated. So no, there's no substance to that argument at all. Is it Turing? Yes, it obeys rules that you can precisely define. Yes, it's Turing complete.
Well, something. This you might appreciate this. This is from. I'm not sure when you filmed this, but I came across this clip and I thought it was hilarious. So what you just said about being uneducated, uninformed. I think this is. Everybody, just sit back and relax for about 30 seconds because this is an epic clip of Perry addressing this exact topic.
So DNA it's an identical process to computer codes, and it's very interesting that. Computer ideas about computers developed early in the 20th century, and Claude Shannon comes along in 1948 and DNA is discovered in 1953. And when we start unraveling DNA, we find out that this incredibly sophisticated communication system has been around for 3 billion years.
Mm-hmm. And we just discovered the communication theory that explains it.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so there needs to be no question that communication theory applies to biology. Okay, all of these concepts can be applied to DNA.
Is that debated anywhere?
Only among people who are ignorant, frankly.
Okay.
Okay. People in the know do not debate
this fact. But not in this credible scientific community. This is well understood.
There is no credible scientific argument to try to say that applying communication theory to biology is somehow inappropriate. Yeah. There's hundreds of scientific papers that go very deep into the subject, and so no, there's
You're not.
There's thousands. There's probably tens of thousands of papers that connect Claude Shannon to genetics. It's if somebody's going to insist on this, I just don't think so.
well, very true. Okay, so let's now get into the real nuts and bolts of this, because obviously there's a significant paradigm shift that you're proposing here. So very early on, you say, let me pull this up real quick for the audience. Codes are not generated by chance or by necessity. They are generated by choice. Now, to me, this has significance for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is how some groups still clinging to the purely deterministic explanation for the origin of codes. As I'm sure there's plenty of origin of life researchers trying to come up with models for this to somehow happen, in spite of all the empirical proof or evidence against that. But can you expand on what you said there in the paper, and then your follow-up point about cognition being needed for what a code actually means, which I think is very significant?
What this means is there's no law of physics that says in the ASCII computer language that 100001 should be A, and that 100010 should be B, and that you flip around one of those ones and zeros and you get a capital instead of a lowercase. You can't derive that from Newton's law or chemistry or anything. Why? Because information is measured in bits. What is the unit of bit? It's the number of choices. A bit is a choice. Claude Shannon explained this in his 1948 landmark paper. And so because you can't derive codes from the laws of physics, then they must come, there's only two other choices. So do they come from randomness or do they come from choices? Well, our experience is that they come from choices. So somebody chose the ASCII table or the Morse code table or the zip code of Nashua, New Hampshire. Like, all of those are choices that somebody made. And the fact that APPLE is the name of a fruit, right? That is a choice that some group of human beings made, and then it was adopted by everybody, and it became a convention. So if you say, well, do they happen by chance? Do codes happen randomly? Well, now you have a problem of, well, when has anybody ever seen one? Can you show me a code that emerged randomly? Well, once again, I've got a $10 million prize for anybody that can show that. And then you could start crunching some numbers and go, well, what are the chances that something like that would occur randomly? And then, well, depending on the size of, the size of the data set, then you can start assigning probabilities. Like, well, okay, well, if we were going to take white noise off of my TV set and come up with a probability that white noise is going to be turned into some other code, what are the chances that would happen by accident without anybody making that choice, right? So there isn't any evidence that chance creates codes. In fact, Information theory 101 is that chance destroys codes and that the destruction is irreversible. And it's called information entropy. So the burden is on anybody else who wants to say that there's anything other than choice that can get you a code.
Now, for the audience, what Perry was describing there in terms of like ASCII and A being, this combination of zeros and ones and such is, or it was actually being expressed in a computer of different, voltages. The root of that from a communication theory perspective is called code mapping. And I've gone into great diatribes about this over and over again with folks. And something that always strikes me is how many folks in the modern era that we live in don't seem to grasp, even programmers don't seem to grasp that a higher level language are strings of the root code and being compiled together in order to, and then having more expansive values code mapped to whatever that command line is. And it really amazes me how many folks don't want to like address that or somehow are debunking the points that you're making. And it's like, well, you do realize that what you're claiming doesn't apply in, say, biology is like saying that ASCII or Unicode doesn't apply in a computer, because at the higher level language standpoint on your computer before it's compiled into machine code, oh wait, that's not what it looks like. And it fascinates me how there's so much confusion on this. Have you run into that same thing?
There are a lot of people who don't want to face the fact that when you apply engineering principles to all of these biological problems, that they drop you at the front door of a mystery. Okay, there's something very, very purposeful about all of this. So how did it get that way? If there's anything that the Evolution Prize proves, it's that the design problem has not been solved in biology. David Hume didn't solve it, and Charles Darwin didn't solve it, and Richard Dawkins didn't solve it. Daniel Dennett didn't solve it. Nobody has solved it. Nobody knows where the genetic code came from. Nobody knows how to get a code without designing one. Nobody knows what makes life so purposeful. Nobody knows how life decides what purposes it's going to pursue. Nobody knows how to make a self-replicating machine. The stuff that we're ignorant about is astonishing in its quantity and quality. And I'm not suggesting that every time you have a mystery, you say, oh, well, God did it. Like, I don't like that. That's not usually helpful. But there's a lot of people that I think they hate the creationists or the intelligent design guys more than they love science. And they would rather make up a story than admit that they don't know something.
Right.
Because it's going to let God in the door. It's going to let those other guys in the door. My contention is, until you acknowledge what you don't know squarely, it's just going to keep kicking you in the ass.
That's a fair point. And it is interesting to me how many folks do that. Oh, you're claiming God of the gaps, when if you ever look at implications of teleology, and it's like, if there's purpose, it has a purpose, and we can quantify the purpose and define what it is. And if this doesn't happen, then that doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. I mean, what always gets me is the strict, like the staggering level of denial of like, oh, there is no such thing as if then in and I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, there's nothing but if thens everywhere in biological systems. And I'm not just talking about the genetic code level. We're talking throughout all the different systems. There's if thens everywhere. And we got people claiming they don't even exist. You're making it up,
Up, down, in, out, every which way you go. It's everywhere. There's contingencies all over the place. And there are responses to the contingencies that are based on the context. It's absolutely remarkable. So, yeah.
Well, let's jump over to I think which some of the kind of dovetails what we're talking about now. And you said, this is a very interesting point here. You said genetic algorithms which allegedly mimic Darwinian evolution are practical implementations of AI. They require programmers to determine and specify parameters and fitness functions and are hardly a panacea in the software industry. Beyond a certain size, computer-optimized solutions become impossible to compute owing to a phenomenon called combinatorial explosion. This places a severe limitation on the power of natural selection to determine outcomes. So I thought that was a very, very interesting point. So a couple of things. Why did you use the word allegedly regarding mimicking evolution? What is combinatorial explosion, and why does this limit what we, at least what we think natural selection is?
Well, so first there's this presumption that when people say that life devolves according to Darwinian principles, there's an assumption that everybody agrees on what those principles actually are. Okay, and there's not. Random mutation and natural selection is not how evolution happens. Evolution happens by contextual, purposeful mutation and selection. And Barbara McClintock showed this, Lynn Margulis showed this, James Shapiro has a brand new book, 2022, just came out. It's 700 pages, and basically every page of that book is somehow or another a testament to the purposefulness and the systematic nature of evolution. It's not random, it's not accidental. And neither are genetic algorithms. There's no such thing as a completely random accidental genetic algorithm. It's a program. Somebody wrote the program. Somebody runs the program. Somebody gives the program goals. It only works if you give it goals, just like life only works if it has goals, right? And so that's what the allegedly part is, okay? So if we acknowledge that what makes any evolution work is what makes all evolution work, which is goals and intention, then yeah, fair enough. Then genetic algorithms do mimic evolution. So what are they capable of? Well, there is a book, I think it's called The Algorithm Design Manual by a guy named Skena. I referenced it in my paper. He says, there are lots and lots of ways in a computer program to optimize something. There's lots of formulas for getting to that ideal or almost ideal or roughly sort of ideal solution to a problem. Hopefully fast, not slow, because we all like our stuff to work fast instead of slow, right? And he says, hey, people, genetic algorithm is usually dead last in terms of all the tools that you can pull out of the toolbox. A genetic algorithm is going to waste more time, waste more computer cycles, get to the answer slower than almost any other tool you can get. Okay, and this guy is not on any kind of creation evolution soapbox. He's just trying to tell you how to pick subroutines that run in your iPhone app or, your PHP program, right? And so the fact about genetic algorithms is they get stuck really easy. It's really easy for a genetic algorithm to just go into an infinite loop and never get out. And you can just watch that little blue wheel spin and spin and spin. In fact, it's so easy to get there that unless you very carefully and narrow the constraints and make sure that program doesn't try to go get lost in the weeds, it'll just go get lost in the weeds. And it's because of something called combinatorial explosion, that there's only so many combinations a computer can try. And every time you add a 1 or a 0, it doubles the number of combinations that have to be tried, right? So 10 to the 10th, 10 to the 11th, 10 to the 12th, right? Or 2 to the 10th, 2 to the 11th, 2 to the 12th, 2 to the 43, 2 to the 44. Well, if I go to 2 to the 43 to 2 to the 44, I just doubled my computation time. So really simple problems, super easy. Optimizing anything of any scale like the shape of an airplane or the biology of a wrist. You're never going to do that with a pure random walk. It's not possible. And any educated computer science person knows this. There's lots of people in biology who've never built anything in their life and they think this is easy. Well, why don't you walk across, why don't you go have a beer with your computer programmer friend and see if your theory matches up to his reality? Why don't you go help him do his job? Why don't you go find him some genetic algorithms? I think it's very interesting that there's certainly a lot of genetic algorithms out there. There isn't any big genetic algorithm industry where you just go and you take it to them and they solve your problem for you. Oh, Windows version, 15.6 is crashing. Let's have the genetic algorithm fix it. Where's that company? Doesn't exist.
Well, it's interesting you read that up because I actually had a debate with a gentleman who was one of the main lead architects of the first variation of Google AdWords way back in the day. And ironically, he's in favor of traditional evolution, all that kind of stuff. And I poised the same, similar concept you're saying now. I was like, seriously, why don't you go to the devs at Google right now and tell them they're all fired because you don't need them for the next iteration of AdWords? Everybody will look at you like you are insane to think that would ever happen. And to me, what I find so fascinating about this, and correct me if you think I'm wrong on this, but the AdWords compared to a biological system is a joke. Like it's child's play compared to what has to be going on to make us live, right? And the number of variables is just gets incredible at that point. Am I right or wrong on that? Or is
you're right, but I also want to point out AdWords is a very, very good environment in which to understand evolution. I mean, I probably have 250,000 customers that have learned how to do AdWords for me. And I tell people, like I get in conversations with business people who have never studied biology, and I tell them, if you have built a website, bid on some keywords, bought traffic, sent it to that website, tweaked your ads, tweaked the landing pages, tweaked the offers, played with the pricing, got the thing to work, which is quite a chore and usually pretty expensive and pretty painful. If you have done that, you probably understand evolution every bit as well as any biologist, because that is an evolutionary process. Okay. It is a process of chaos resolved by intent. Okay. What is natural selection in Google AdWords? It's the market. How much are people paying for plumbers in Louisville, Kentucky this week? Well, there might be all kinds of people that'll pay $90 an hour for a plumber and zero who will pay $200. Unless there's some crazy emergency and they just can't find one. Like the market determines like what people will pay for stuff and what people want. That's natural selection. Okay. And like any entrepreneur working from a kitchen table using any digital advertising platform can go out and experience natural selection right now. Hey,
well,
right?
You're 100% correct. And what's interesting on that too is and I think this dovetails with the whole point of your paper, right? Is on the business side as well and the consumer side, but let's focus on the business side, right? The cognition necessity is in full display, right? Whether it be, I have background in this too, and it's like sometimes on the AdWords, it comes down to changing one word in the headline, in the main headline, right? It can change the click through and the conversion rate exponentially, right? I know you know this beyond. I mean, you wrote the book on the topic, right? So like this is a well-established concept, right? Like, but what happened? What was required? Analysis.
You had to try. You had to willfully try something new. Like you have a goal. I think this will work, and you try it, and it doesn't work, so you try something else, and then that doesn't work and you try something else, and then something works and you have this big eureka moment, and then you go with that for a while, right? And then eventually, like, there's some other breakthrough, and you just keep going and going and going. It's always intentional. It's anytime you see evolution happening, somebody is sneaking purpose and intentionality and goals into it somewhere. All the genetic algorithms have goals in some way, shape, or form. Somebody has prescribed a fitness function, right? And so the key to using genetic algorithms is being good at crafting a fitness function that defines exactly what is desired and somehow or another steers the process away from falling into the weeds, right? So all evolution is purposeful, which is the whole punchline of evolution 2.0. Like, you're never getting around the question of purpose. All codes are purposeful. All communication systems are purposeful. All evolution is purposeful. There's no getting around it. What people have done is they have declared biology to be purposeless, mostly out of ignorance and denial. It's obvious that a frog is purposeful. It's obvious that a kitten is purposeful. It's obvious that a bacteria is purposeful. So you never get around that. When you face up to it, I think that's when you finally start making breakthroughs.
Well, no, I would totally agree with you on that. And I think something else you mentioned, and a good portion, by the way, good portion of the paper is actually covers what I'm about to bring up here right now is, and this was negative entropy.
Yes.
And how choice and negative entropy and how choice is negative entropy and cognition requires choice, right? So what is, number one, am I correct on that interpretation? If so, what does that mean? And how does channel noise relate to this? And something I know you've talked about in great detail, which is the ultimate loss of information from noise. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So let's define some terms here. So entropy, classic thermodynamic entropy, is when the toast pops out of the toaster, it gets colder, not hotter, every time, right? When you burn gas in your engine, the gasoline turns into exhaust and the car moves, and that happens every time, and it doesn't go in reverse. The exhaust never blows itself back into your engine and turns into gasoline. Okay, so that's entropy. It's the loss of heat. Okay, and there is no such thing as negative entropy in thermodynamics. It doesn't exist. There is only positive entropy, which is loss of heat energy. Now, Erwin Schrödinger wrote a book called What is Life in the 1940s. And he said, now he's a physicist, remember, he said, organisms have this strange property of what I call negentropy or negative entropy, which is your neat room should become messy, your neat pile of rocks should fall down and become rubble, but living things are always pushing things from disorder to order. Birds are building nests, and beavers build dams, and people build houses, and cells maintain homeostasis. And he says, I call this negentropy, and he says they're not violating thermodynamic entropy, but by some mechanism that we do not understand, they are turning disorder into order. So negentropy has been in the literature for decades, and lots of people understand and agree that this is the mystery of biology. What is negentropy? What I say in the paper is negentropy is negative information entropy, which is a choice. So let's talk about information entropy for a second. Okay, so John, have you ever done recording, like a band, or when you were a kid, did you ever record your CDs onto a cassette tape? Like, you ever do any of that kind of stuff?
Yep. Cassettes and CDs. Yep.
Okay, so
Actually,
anybody,
floppy disk. I forgot about floppy disks, man. We gotta go back. We gotta go way back to '90s.
anybody who's done recording, especially with imperfect recording media, has dealt with noise. You record a CD onto a cassette, and you play the cassette back in your car. It's got all this, there's all this noise on the cassette that wasn't on the CD. That is what Claude Shannon calls information entropy. It's when you take a signal and you put it through an imperfect, noisy medium, the noise gets added and you can't take it back out. Well, if you have when you create information, you are doing the opposite of entropy. Okay, so if I say, John, I've got a bucket of red marbles and blue marbles, and I want you to arrange the red marbles and the blue marbles into a Morse code signal that says, "Hi, Perry." When you pull marbles out of the bucket and line them up to say something, you are creating information. You're creating bits of information. That is negative entropy. My assertion is that the way that biology creates order is biology creates informational choices which control the building of chemicals. Okay, so if you create however many gigabytes of genetic code, and that makes amino acids and proteins, then that is negative entropy, and that is a choice. And when Barbara McClintock's corn plants rearranged their DNA and repaired their own genome so that the plant could go on and reproduce itself instead of dying, that was negative entropy. It's an absolutely defensible position. In fact, it's a perfectly clear explanation of what neg entropy is. It's choice. Go ahead.
Well, in line with what you're saying there, what seems to strike me is we talking about like, okay, this is what happens, but then you have to address the how, right? And you're kind of touching on this in terms of the cognition and the choice aspect. I know that's the ultimate point, but in terms of like for one of our communication systems, right, we have checksums and error correction codes and all this other kind of stuff in order to overcome noise, right, and be able to reconstruct information that's been lost in the channel, right? Is that from a communication system perspective? That's kind of what we're having to talk about, right? Like, the message is coming over the channel. We know there's going to be noise. There's going to be loss. It's going to be decoded and reconstructed on the other end. We need to have things to account for the fact that yes, we know there will be loss from the noise. How do we account for this, right? In order to accomplish the negative entropy that you're referring to. Is that correct?
Yeah. So you're in your car and you're watching a YouTube video, and you're in the passenger seat, I hope, right? And you're whizzing down the expressway, and you're watching your video. Well, there's all kinds of cars and trucks around. There's radio transmitters. There's engine noise. There's all this stuff. Yet you have the miracle that you're able to watch the video. Normally, the video streams perfectly. Maybe once in a while it gets interrupted, but it's amazing how it works. Well, the only reason that works is they have built so many extra bandwidth into the system so that whenever there's an error, that the information can be retransmitted in time to still play on time. And there's a whole sophisticated error correction system that an engineer would understand that everybody takes for granted. That is doing the equivalent of neg entropy, but it's not actually neg entropy. It's redundancy. Okay, it's detecting that there was an error, and it's going back and saying, hey, since we have a few extra microseconds here, would you send me that missing packet and I'll stick it where it belongs, and John will continue watching his video the way that he wants. Okay, now everybody knows if we just leave that system on its own, it's not like it's going to evolve a better video.
It's not going to go from 480 to 4K.
Right.
So.
It's not going to go from 480 to 4K. But what's amazing about living things is living things, so to speak, analogously do go to 480 from 480 to 4K. Living things do improve their performance because they're trying, they're making choices. If you read James Shapiro's evolution work, which is a huge body of work now, you can start almost anywhere, and you'll find places where you put cells, you put yeast cells under stress, and at some point, they will go into a hypermutation mode, and they'll go, okay, I can't eat this. We're starving to death. We got to do something. They'll start like rearranging genes. They'll start moving things around. And then all of a sudden, hey, we can digest this lactose. Woo! Organism just adapted, new dietary opportunity. Now we can go eat all this milk. This happens all the time. Well, nobody's AI does this. It sort of does it in a crude way, doesn't do it very well. Living things do it all the time. And we don't really know where they get the ability to do this. If we did, we'd have real AI instead of Siri.
Right. Some people are claiming, oh, this must be random because well, here's kind of my interpretation of a lot of this stuff. The more I read about it and dive into it, I think I'm like, wow, that's pretty amazing. That, and to your point, like that would be, I know for a fact we're trying to get our systems to do X, right?
Yeah.
But then to me, it seems like on the biology side, the people aren't really like going down the rabbit hole that we're talking about now. They seem to be so like, oh, it just must be random. And it's like, what? So hang on. So you're saying because we don't understand how it works, therefore it must be random? That doesn't really make sense. Doesn't really make sense to me.
It is an automatic knee-jerk abdication. It is really, it's not terribly fashionable in most scientific circles to ever just say, hey, people, we have no idea. It's just not cool to say that. It doesn't go over well in science conferences. It doesn't make you sound good. People just use it. And so the word random, as well as the word stochastic, have just been massively abused in biology. Most of the time in biology, if someone uses the word random and to a lesser extent stochastic, what it means is something very complicated that I either lack the budget, the time, or the inclination to go explore. It's very rarely actually random, actually stochastic. Now, sometimes it is. I'll certainly give you that. But most of the time, your job is to find the non-random actual cause of why it did what it did.
We, in line with we're talking about the randomness stuff. So I think you made a very interesting. By the way, prefaced all this, folks. There's multiple sections throughout this paper where Perry creates formal arguments on a variety of topics, outlines different things, overall structure. So, for all the folks who are running around claiming there's nothing of substance in this paper, you obviously didn't read it or you didn't comprehend it, and maybe you're one of those individuals that Perry was just describing in terms of they think, oh, it's just a bunch of stochastic. Random stuff. But one of the arguments you put forth in here, which I thought was very interesting about this exact topic, right? She said there is a severe limit on the size of useful statements that can be generated by randomness. And you backed it up with a statistical syllogism, which I'm going to pull up here on the screen here. And you said, one, for a computer to generate specific statements consisting of more than 332 bits of information through a random brute force process requires 10 to the 100th trials to test all combinations. 10 to the 100th trials could not be made by any real world computer in the history of the universe. Therefore, specific statements longer than 332 bits are not realizable through randomness. Can you kind of expand on that? And I think you also mentioned something in the paper about how this is like the equivalent of 166 base pairs in relation to this number of bits. Is that right?
Yeah. So let's just say we're trying to guess passwords. Everybody watching this has a Yahoo account, a Google account, a YouTube account, a bank account, an email account, right? And we all protect this stuff through passwords. And how long are those passwords? They're 8 to 12 characters usually. And we all know through experience that 8 to 12 characters is pretty much enough to keep people out of your stuff, right? And why is that? It's because, well, how many combinations does the thief have to try before they're going to guess the right one? Well, 42 letters requires 10 to the power of 100 guesses, and there's only 10 to the power of 80 particles in the universe, right? And so, go get out your calculator and figure out the fastest computer that anybody's ever invented, and go, how many passwords can that computer try before it finally breaks into my email account? So this is what we're talking about. And so now if we go to an analogy and we say, so is there any part of any genome that could be regarded as a password where only this combination would work? Well, we know there's lots of them. They're in the Krebs cycle. It only works if there's certain things. It's in things like hemoglobin. It's in things like the Hox gene. Like there's lots of different variations of Hox genes, but for the most part, Hox genes are within this very, very narrow set of constraints, and there's almost no variation whatsoever on some of the proteins and stuff. Okay, so for all practical purposes, that is a password. So if that coding sequence is longer than 42 letters, which ain't long, then there's no way that a random process was what got that way, which goes back to the thesis of evolution 2.0, which is that evolution is a purposeful, contextual process by which the organism makes educated guesses about what is going to work. And we don't know how it makes those educated guesses, other than that we know for a fact that all living cells are cognitive and have cognition. There's a wonderful paper by James Shapiro, who's one of the most meticulous scholars in biology. And he makes a very robust case that literally every living cell has cognition, which is the ability to take inputs, affect its environment, compute and calculate responses to unforeseeable situations, and succeed some percentage of the time. If our computers or our technology had this ability, whoever owned that company would be worth more than Google in about 2 years. But we currently do not have that. We do not know. So if you want to know, sit at the feet of nature and be humble and learn.
I would say, yeah, that's a great point. It's and what I find interesting right now is the point you just made about sitting at the feet of nature. All the moves towards DNA computation and things of that nature that have the potential to solve a lot of the computation issues that we're talking about, and maybe superior to our computers and all those kind of things that I just find extraordinarily fascinating. That it's finally being, well, everything we've been talking about today gets dismissed or has been dismissed by many for decades, right? As being the actual reality that must be faced. And then now that we're starting to come around to it and recognize like, oh, turns out that this might be better than what we're doing in our most advanced, our bleeding edge tech is not even close to the level of computation that's taking place inside biological systems. Oh, maybe we should start, oh, wait, there's a whole industry called biomimicry that's going on, right? Where they're trying to find these solutions. It's interesting to me how, like, on the other side of the equation, people are like, oh, this doesn't exist. You're making this up. It's just nothing but analogy. There is no computation. It's like, not sure what world you live in, but that's not the real one.
I find that the kind of arguments that you're referring to, I mostly hear from lazy materialistic baby boomers. I don't hear them nearly so much from Gen X, Gen Y, or Gen Z. I think there's a generation of biologists, especially evolutionary biologists, that quite frankly has been very lazy, and they have dominated the conversation for a long time, but they are not the ones making the breakthroughs. They are not the ones doing the genetics. They are not the ones doing the epigenetics. And I mean, while the materialistic mindset is baked in a lot of ways that people don't even realize, and they just kind of mindlessly repeat, that the kind of dogmatic materialism is on retreat, and it should be. It deserves to be. It's frankly, it was completely lazy. It was pure hubris and abdication. You know, like the junk DNA argument. There's no junk DNA. CRISPR came from junk DNA, for crying out loud. So, you know, I do feel, you know, being a person that goes to science conferences and is very engaged in a lot of things, I find people under the age of 35 to be a lot more curious and a lot more flexible in their thinking than a lot of their professors ever were.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm reading to bring up CRISPR. I'm currently reading A Crack in Creation by Jennifer. I murder her last name, Doudna.
Yeah.
One of the lead for the audience. She and her team were one of the lead groups. They didn't discover CRISPR, but they were the ones that kind of figured out how it worked and how to modify it and, you know, use it for what we take for granted. We're starting to take for granted now, ironically. And I mean, we've only really known how it. Really discovered it in the last decade. Well, it's like, it was like 2011, I think, when they first published 2012 when they first published a paper on it. And that whole reading through her book, and as they're describing all the processes and the things that have to be executed and all they work together, the intricacies. And what really something I found very fascinating that really stuck out to me in her book was she talks about how the Cas genes basically, well, I think they must have co-evolved. Otherwise, this process wouldn't work correctly. And that really stuck out to me. You're talking about a significant, to your point on the going past 42, you're getting into some crazy stuff here, right? Obviously, if you don't just have one gene, you've got a whole series of genes that are working in unison, and that's before you account for how are they expressed and all the genes that are necessary for their expression and the proteins to be synthesized that are used for all these processes, right? Like, people just kind of take that for granted and gloss it over. And I'm not saying she was, because she was clearly recognizing the complexity and like how mind-bending this stuff is. But those average individuals or the boomers that you're referring to just want to be like, no big deal. And I'm like, man, you guys not, the way that's described, you know, it is straight up programming. I mean, you're cutting and pasting and slicing and dicing, and it's a truly amazing process. So anybody who does not know about how CRISPR and all the Cas genes work, it's worthwhile to go dive into. I'm assuming with what you're doing in the cancer research side, I'm assuming CRISPR has amazing implications in that world, doesn't it?
It does. And if you want an extreme example of what you just described, there's a guy who Shapiro quotes numerous times in his work, named David Prescott, who discovered that protozoans under the right level of stress, under the right conditions, would suddenly go into this hypermutation mode where they would rearrange 100,000 pieces of their genome and just move it all around. I mean, try to imagine like opening 12 Microsoft Word documents and taking entire sections and just, you know, moving them all around. And not only that, when they get done, you still have a functional protozoan, right? It's not like it just crashed and died. It's like whatever it did, it actually still works, and it works differently than it worked before. Okay. Now, if it's one thing to realize that you can't even rearrange 42 letters by chance in any finite universe, right? In all the time since the Big Bang, it still wouldn't be enough time. Okay, so it's one thing to realize that. It's another thing to realize, well, not only is it way more than 42 letters, it's actually 100,000 pieces, which gets you right back to what Barbara McClintock said in her 1984 Nobel Prize paper. What does a cell know about itself? Which is the cognition question. I think the central question in biology is cognition, which in a funny way, it's like the central question in human existence. I think, therefore I am. John, you're having an experience of talking to me, and I'm having an experience talking to you. How is this possible? Well, this is the question, right? It all goes back to we're agents.
Right. Well, and I think in the paper you made a great point on this in your arguments you put up. Negative entropy is choice. Only agents make choices. Therefore, negative entropy requires agency. And I think one of the big issues that I've run into, I'd love to get your opinion on this, is when you make those kinds of points, right? People want to immediately jump to consciousness from the same perspective that we operate from, right? That, you can't have choice, and agency can't exist unless you have they want to limit agency only to us, basically, right? And we're the only potential agents, and it's that's not exactly true. However, you can say that might be the preceding necessity to be able to get to the ongoing choice. But anyway, have you run into that as well?
Yeah. So if you want some good reading on this from somebody who's really thought about it, you should read Michael Levin, who's a friend of mine at Tufts University. And Michael, I was talking to Michael last year, and he said, if you go to almost any bioengineering conference, there will be somebody's going to give a talk on bioethics. Okay. And because there's always this elephant in the room of how much right do we have to mess with all this stuff, right? And if we CRISPR the frogs, are we hurting the frogs, and do we, right, all that? And he said it's just almost 100% predictable that they're going to draw this Darwinian tree of life and say, see, those of us at the top of the tree, if they're furry and nice, or if they have big brains, then we don't mess with them, right? That would be unethical. And so we got to respect those. And then we go down to the bottom of the Darwinian tree to the cephalopods and the cockroaches, and we could do pretty much anything they want down there. Because if you study cognition, he goes, that is totally jacked up. He goes, are you going to try to tell me that a slime mold doesn't know something? Serious?
So are you saying that the vegans are onto something?
Well, I mean, this goes way beyond the scope of I'm not going to eat meat here, okay? But you get the point, right? No, listen, cognition is at every level of every organism, and I don't know that my immune cells pray and before they go to bed and brush their teeth. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that these organisms, they clearly manifest something resembling self-awareness, right? Have you ever chased an ant with a magnifying glass? It kind of behaves the same way as a human would if you were chasing a human with a magnifying glass. Hello, are you going to tell me that they just don't mind? Right. And there's a lot of people, they don't want to deal with these kind of questions. And so they just want to treat everything that's not furry or has big brains, it's just dumb, and we can do anything we want. Well, if cognition tells you anything, if you're honest about it, it tells you that we have a responsibility to steward the earth, right? And then you have to ask like more subtle questions like, well, if I kill the deer, is it a less violent way to die than however it would die wandering around in the forest? And then now we got to start asking those kind of questions, right? And so you're never getting away from cognition. I think it is the central question of humanity, of biology, of biochemistry, and it's staring us right in the face. And when Barbara McClintock said, "What does a cell know about itself?" I don't think the world was prepared to reckon with that question back then. Now that we have things like the hard problem of consciousness, and lots of people are talking about it, now maybe the human race is ready to start wrestling with these questions, but these are the questions.
Well, Perry, I don't know if you missed the memo, but the hard problem of consciousness has been solved.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if you missed out on that one, but apparently, supposedly it's been solved.
Okay.
I hear that all the time. It cracks me up. Oh, we've already solved that one. That's no. And I'm like, to me, it seems like we're getting further away from solving that one, not closer to it. The more we're, and I think to your point of, if there is cognition of some level happening in, bacteria or molds and stuff, like if there's cognition of some level happening there, then we're way away from understanding human level cognition, right? And I think something you said in the paper, I think really kind of encapsulated this. Let me see if I can find that real quick. He said the central question in biology is agency, the origin and nature of choice. A cognition-based model has the potential to solve and unify origin of life, origin of information, evolution, consciousness, AI, and cancer. And I thought that was a very succinct way to put that point. And I don't know, do you think that at least with the quote unquote establishment, right, in academia that are being the boomers that are still in control, right? Do you think that their desperation to cling to chemicals to code to cognition versus cognition code chemicals, do you think their resistance is like preventing research or preventing discoveries that could be happening at a more accelerated rate?
No question about it. In fact, so last week I was at the American Association of Cancer Research Evolution Dynamics, Cancer Evolution Dynamics Conference in Tampa, Florida. And I know a bunch of people there. I'm on one of their committees, their Cancer and Evolution Working Group Committee. And I had a poster session, which it's like a little trade show where people walk around and they, hear your thesis and you explain your paper. And so I have all these oncologists come along and they're like, okay, so what's this and what's this about? And my poster was essentially a condensed version of my paper that you and I are discussing today. And I said, well, we've been sitting through all these sessions and everybody's sequencing all these genomes of all these tumors and figuring out these oncogenes and which gene, which genetic mutations are driver mutations. And they're like, yeah, all day long. And I said, there's a question that nobody's really asking in these sessions. I said, tell me what you think about this. I said, you have a pancreas and you had these pancreas cells and they were happily doing what pancreas cells are supposed to do, right? And they're like, yep. And one day, a couple of them got upset. And they said, I'm sick of being a pancreas. Being a pancreas sucks. I'm going to go live my life. And they go rogue, right? And they're like, yeah, they do. And then they form tumors. And then you kill the tumors and they get bigger. And then your friend Tom dies of pancreatic cancer, which I've witnessed firsthand. That is ugly. And they're like, yep. And I said, you know what nobody's asking? What made them want to go rogue? At some point, those cells made a choice. Just like you throw steak on your kitchen table and you tell your dog, Rover, don't eat that steak. And he knows what you mean. And he looks at, and you leave the room and he either eats the steak or he doesn't, but he makes a decision, right? I said, what if the pancreas cells deciding to be a tumor is just like your dog deciding to eat your steak? And they go, And I go, this is why what I'm talking about when I talk about cognition. I believe the beginning of a cancer case is a cognitive choice made by cells in your body, which are intelligent. And we got to ask what pushed them into fight or flight. And I'm talking to professional oncology researchers and at the AACR conference, and they're like, that's a great question. I think, yeah, there are a couple of people that are like, this is mind blowing. Right now, it shouldn't be. To me, it's like common sense, but I'm not them.
Well, to me, it seems like I follow your train of thought there immediately. And I think when you factor in the known reality that every cell is like the surface level is nothing but sensors, right? To taking inputs, sending outputs and signals to the nucleus to do X, Y, and Z. And we know epigenetic modifications are the direct real-time result of environmental cues, factors, right? Like, to me, the point you're making makes sense, especially if it's like, oh, there's all these bad things we don't like, go into freak out mode. Or correct me if I'm wrong on this, but we know that a lot of cancers are caused by the sudden inactivation of different repair mechanisms, right? Like P53 goes haywire and is now no longer fixing. And for the audience, P53 is like one of the it's like the master DNA repair mechanism. There's a boatload of other ones, but it's kind of like one of the big dogs, if you will. But in many cancers, P53 goes nuts or it stops being expressed, or something happens to it, some kind of error, and then cancers just come up all over the place. And obviously, there's way more than that example, but it's very interesting what you're saying there, because you would think we know that preceding this, the cell is going to have all of the checksum error correction mechanisms already in place. So why do they stop working? Well, that kind of like why do they get turned off kind of thing?
Why does the cell want to switch them off, right? Like P53 is a kill switch for telling the cell to die when it's supposed to die. Well, why did the cell suddenly have this will to live and this will to overcome everything that came against it, including your immune system? Why doesn't it want to cooperate with the other pancreas cells anymore? And see, that kind of thinking has been explicitly forbidden in biology for 100 years. Oh, you can't think anthropomorphically. That's going to lead you into some very wrong conclusions. Okay, so what? We're going to treat life like it's dead. Well, that's what you guys have been doing for the last 100 years. How's it working?
Right.
Well, it's not working in cancer hardly at all.
Right. Well, okay. So I know we're almost out of time. So here's a thought. I think kind of dovetails what we're talking about here, right? So the 100 years plus rejection of any of the things that we've been talking about, and I think, and something I want you to address here is because so many people I know that have kind of perused through your paper have said this, and a lot of things that we're talking about now just get dismissed by this. And a lot of folks are going to be like, oh, so basically what you're saying is God did it. In terms of how all this happens and came to be, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not really sure how they come to that conclusion, because I think obviously we've discussed that rather detailed. But are you suggesting that we should just rely on God of the gaps to explain all this stuff, and we should just stop doing research, or we should do the reciprocal, but perhaps be looking at it from the perspective of whether it was created by the God of Christianity or otherwise? There is purpose that must be accounted for in biological systems, and therefore in the way we're approaching research.
So I bring up the God question explicitly in the paper. And I say, there are 5 explanations for where the genetic code could have come from. it occurred randomly and spontaneously. Is an undiscovered law of physics. It was created by aliens, or God did it. And I said, I dislike God of the gaps arguments. And furthermore, if you just assume that God made the genetic code and then here comes everything else, that it at least implies that code creates cognition, which isn't even true. So I'm starting with cognition. This is the central question. And we've got to understand what's right under our nose. My belief is that the secret to cognition is literally right at the end of our nose, because the end of our nose has cells. It is there. It's waiting to be discovered. Now, what I believe about God is that if you simply start with the presumption that the universe, the cosmos, is divinely ordered and purposeful in ways that you probably don't even understand, that's good enough. You don't have to define, well, when did God show up and where? I don't know. I just have a presumption. If you presume that things happen for reasons instead of not happening for reasons, you're going to further the progress of science inherently. And I think the problem is people have polarized on this issue, and they go, well, there's either no God in the picture or God is always the explanation. Well, God is a million light years away kind of an explanation, but you still have to do the work of science right now to understand, why is this yeast cell deciding to digest milk?
Well, that point you're making there always kind of gets me in relation to things like, if you're any kind of, whenever the Chinese get a crashed plane from the Pacific Ocean and are undergoing reverse engineering of one of our drones or something, just because they weren't around or haven't accounted for all the thought process and the actions of the engineers in the United States who designed the original, has nothing to do with whether or not they have to apply their own cognitive ability to determine how it all works and how they can recreate it.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, given the fact that we're undergoing reverse engineering all the time, that's one of the things I've always found interesting about the whole God of the gaps dismissal points. And science stops if you believe in God of any level, whether it be young Earth creation, older, theistic evolution, doesn't matter which iteration you take. If you think God's in the equation, therefore you dismiss science and you want to just not do any kind of research. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever. That's you're arguing that we're just going to say, hey, let's suspend all reverse engineering, even versus if I know it was engineered on the front end, or has at least in a minimum has the appearance of being engineered and follows engineering principles. Therefore, I should be able to reverse the logic flow and figure out how it all works, or how we can modify it to our own extreme, or how you can fix it, right? Hey, your car breaks down. Hey, I'm going to go read the manual and see if I could figure out which part I need to replace to solve XYZ problem, that kind of stuff. Anyway, that just always gets me every time.
Well, I think in biology, what's truly productive is presuming that the organism has been granted the capacity to engineer itself. And when you look at it through that lens, most questions are at least in principle answerable. Whereas if you look at well, God stuck his divine screwdriver down in here and he just started tinkering with stuff, I think that usually leads you in a wrong direction, or it eventually gets you stuck. I think nature has been endowed with incredible capacities that we're even barely conscious of. And so I am sensitive to people disliking the God of the gaps arguments, and sometimes they get too ham-fisted. I understand why people resist them. It took a while for me to understand what the problem was, and then it finally got clearer for me. Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of times for the for the atheists, especially the hardcore atheists, they recognize things like, well, if there is a code, that means there's a coder.
Right.
God doesn't exist, therefore it can't be a code. Because if I concede that there is a code, therefore I have to also concede that there must be a coder, which must precede, and the whole point you're making in the paper of cognition, whether it be divine or otherwise, it appears to be, the evidence seems to be indicating that the cognition must precede the code mapping to chemicals. And anyway.
Yeah, most atheists, they understand the implications of DNA being code like really fast. It's why they react so viscerally. Like, yeah, well, at the most simple level, yeah, there is no solution to the design argument in biology. So you're either gonna admit it or you're just gonna find a way to be in denial. And human beings are spectacular at being denial. And you have to admit, being a member of a cult is fun, and being in denial is fun, and having addictions is fun, and it just doesn't often work so good in the end. That's the problem, right?
That's very true. Now, Perry, I've kept you for an hour and 20 minutes, and we got a little bit over time. By the way, sidebar, a good friend of yours, Cy Gart, is in the audience.
Oh, good.
What's this?
Hi,
and Cy, thanks so much for those in the audience. Cy actually put me in contact with Perry, and I can help to make all this happen. So thank you very much for that, Dr. Gart, for helping make this conversation happen. Actually, we have two of them now, obviously. Before we wrap up, you got any last words? Anything going on in your world? I know, by the way, folks, if you want to learn more about Perry directly, in the description is perrymarshall.info. You want to learn more about what he's doing and everything's going on. But like I said, is there anything going on for you that you'd like to let the audience know about?
There's one thing that I want to let everybody know about. My dear friend, Dennis Noble, brilliant evolution guy at Oxford University, is debating Richard Dawkins on June 4 at the How the Light Gets In conference at 10:30 in the morning UK time. And they are discussing whether the selfish gene theory needs to be trashed and obsoleted, or whether it's still useful in the 21st century. And I know some people at Oxford University who have prodded and provoked until that debate got put together. And so it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to be there in person and see what happens. And I don't know. I have no idea. They're streaming it or anything. Don't know. But June 4, 10:30 in the morning UK time, it's going to happen. So,
well, I'm gonna have to look out for that, because that should be renamed The Trial of Richard Dawkins. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that'll be good. Well, I'm gonna look that up. Appreciate it very much. And folks, as I tell everybody again, if you have not read Perry's book, Evolution 2.0, Breaking the Deadlock Between Darwin and Design, you're missing out. It's phenomenal. And for all of the atheists on YouTube who go on their diatribes about how it's not code, go read the book. Just read the book and take the time to learn the basics of information and communication theory. It's very well broken down. There's even bullet points at the end of every chapter for you to, get it pounded into your head over and over again about these different principles. And before we wrap up, folks, the clip that you got, a lot of you are on the fans of the channel have seen it many times, but I think we should kind of culminate with this before we wrap up here, is a conversation that I snagged, a clip of it, from Perry's, when they were launching the Evolution 2.0 prize at the Royal Society, and Dennis Noble sat down with them. And again, I say this all the time, folks. If you think all things Perry is saying about code and all these things and information and communication theory don't apply to genetics, fly over to London, go have a meeting with the Royal Society, and tell them that Perry is conning them. And it's complete farce, okay? And then you can go here. I'll show you yourself.
I'm talking at the moment with Perry Marshall and Kevin Ham. Perry Marshall is from Chicago in the United States, and Kevin Ham is from Vancouver in Canada. And we have just taken part in the United Kingdom launch of a huge prize to be won by anybody who can produce the genetic code or a genetic code via natural process generating it itself. Mm-hmm. Perry, have I got that right, first of all?
That's right. Any code, any encoding, message decoding system that can come out of an emergent property from chemicals to code would qualify.
Yes.
And I think it's one of the most fundamental questions in all of science. And it just hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves.
That's right, it hasn't. And I think that's partly why we've been highlighting it in the meeting that we've just had here at the Royal Society in London. You can't get much more prestigious than that, can you?
No, it's
by the way.
It's delightful.
Yes. Now, question perhaps also to Kevin, does it really need to be 10 million? You know, I'm a scientist. To me, that's a huge sum of money.
Well, like I said, I get a joke about, I crack up about that every time, and it's like, man, you need to go find Kevin and be like, hey, Perry is he's jacking your money. That all that money in your in the equity fund is just it's a scam. But anyway, so Perry, thanks, man. Thanks again for taking the time to do this. Any last words before we go?
The price really should probably be 100 million or $1 billion, but 10 will have to be good enough. I've had the conversation with a lot of people where they're like, well, this is actually worth way more than 10 million. I go, yeah, it is. It's as big as E equals MC squared, or the invention of the transistor, or the internet. Like it's absolutely huge. So yeah, 10 million, it'll get it started.
In the era of unicorn valuations that we live in, you're right, 10 million is nothing. Oh, well, folks, thank you so much for it's me.
Well, I'm getting a frozen screen from John's end, so if you guys are able to hear me, I really appreciate you guys listening, and it's been great bantering with John about this. He has really great questions. He's a really bright guy, and this has been a fun conversation. So thank you very much, John.
Well, of course, I crash as we're wrapping up. Anyway, sorry about that. Well, as I was saying, folks, Perry, thanks so much for your time. Greatly appreciate it very much. And folks, take the time, click the link, read the paper, read the book. And as I always say at the end of these, take the time to use your critical thinking skills. And no matter what in conclusion you reach, make sure that your conclusion is